interactions that occur in the making of any photographs or visual archives. The book, therefore, addresses key issues facing photography, including gender, race, societal hierarchies, divisions, and their role in shaping and reshaping identities and provoking resistance or conformity. Alors, we are just going to... Voilà. Here you have a few, on the left, pictures showing in the spirit of the collaborative processes, a few pictures of the authors of the book in various situations. The book is structured in 8 clusters, 8 big chapters. And of course, because we have only 1 hour, it will take, I think, a week to review the book properly. So because we have only 1 hour, we have selected a few cases among 3 chapters. And of course, we will be able to go further if we have time. In each cluster, you have a number of cases, and each case is presented with the same protocol, let's say, including photographs, quotes, testimonies, and contextual text. So in the layout of the book and the layout of each double page, you will see this collaborative process that has been laid out in a very original, singular way, but also very relevant way regarding the subject of the book. Alors, we'll start with the questions. Alors, first maybe to Wendy, very simple question. How did the idea of the book emerge?
Well, I think I go back. That's what I'm interested in, is that Susan and I... Oh, closer? Okay. Susan and I first communicated in 1970 with a book she did called Learning to See, which was a very important book and project at the time with Polaroid. And but we continued to follow each other and follow what we were doing for years, and we even lived together for a while. And then 10 years ago, she asked if I would like to work on a book about seminal projects on collaboration, or collaborative projects that were seminal to us and how we moved through our work. But we quickly realized that we weren't going to write that book. And we said, well, who can we get? And we talked to lots of people, and we thought, this is why it took 10 years to do this. And we quickly settled on Ariella Azoulay, who I had just met in Israel, and Susan had just met. And so we asked her to join us, and she said yes. She was still living in Israel at the time, and but she had a very different idea than we did. So our approach changed radically, and but it led us to think about and question the idea of collaborating, and which led us to also including Laura Wexler and Lee Rayford. And these questions that we began to ask were what led to the structure of the book, the 8 clusters that we were talking about. So it was all, our working together was very collaborative, but it also switched and changed. And as you see the pictures you're looking at now, that is another step that we made, which is to include the audience or students in laying out what we might do. So what you're seeing is the first step in communication outside of ourselves. That's what I
very clear, Wendy. So we said that the book is a sum of 115 cases throughout the history of photography. You find all kinds of photography genre represented in the book. But my question to you, Suzanne, is how did you, among this quite complex authorship, shared authorship. How did you selected the cases in each cluster?
I think I'm just going to pick up part of the thread because you're looking at something that's an important shift. So Wendy referred to a conversation we were having. We moved from a personal conversation about what had inspired us to do collaborative work to then including Ariella, who was challenging us, why not look at the whole history of photography? Of course, that's an Ariella-esque kind of challenge. So that's when we began to think about the difference between private conversations and how to really open this up. The first stage of that was really through teaching. So Ariella was teaching, by that time she'd left Israel, she came to Brown University, she had a group of graduate students, and Wendy and I met with those classes. That evolved to the first stage of thinking about what, maybe we should just go back to the other page. What you see in this on the right side is what we ended up templating, but the premise was a square represented a project, quotes by a protagonist or a subject, and a set of images. And we designed with the students this idea of take any project that you think of as collaborative, break it into these elements to create what we call a square. And so what you're seeing here is actually the next stage, going from working in universities, which Laura then came into this process when we were showcasing it at Aperture, and I'm very happy Chris Boot is here because he gave us walls. And so for the first time, we went from a classroom to walls. So we would take over the walls in a grid-like format, as you see here, to open it up to a kind of a dialogue, what's here, what's missing. I mean, Lori Novak has a project here. She was at that Aperture gathering. We opened it up to graduate students to really try and say, and they went around literally with Post-it notes. So if you look at this collage on the left, you'll see evidence of this opening up process, dialoguing, as you said, with audiences. So the criteria became not only what we thought, but what others thought we should be including. I think that's really seminal to the project. I want to just pass to Laura. Laura came into the project when we put it up at Aperture and invited, 75 practitioners, teachers, graduate students for a full day at Aperture. And we gathered in little groupings around these clusters and said, what more belongs here? Maybe.
Yeah, and I think when I entered this, is it
Closer.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay. When I entered this, which was right after the Aperture workshop, I brought the idea of asking a whole community of writers to respond to the projects that people were suggesting were collaborative in different ways. And so we further opened this conversation up far beyond ourselves. And it became at that point an experience of very deep learning for all of us, because all of us were challenged by not only the new projects that the students brought, but the ideas that the writers brought to the projects that we were showcasing. So it was that we were having workshops. Ariella and I were teaching a class. Wendy, I think, other Lee Rayford came into it and they taught a class at Berkeley. Other people taught classes. It just became a process outside of ourselves that formed a community, and it was a community that contested itself. It was not a community that was relaxed about what we were doing and about the issue of collaboration.
Alors, Nora, since you are taking the floor and you are the academics among the three, what can you very briefly say for you what are the three major problematics which are raised by the books? We are going to go into cases, but before, just an overview, very quick overview.
Okay. Well, first of all, the five of us are in very different fields with very different decades of experience. You just heard that this really started in 1970, and actually Suta and I graduated college together in 1970 as classmates. So this has been a long process. And we're not alike. in fact, one of the things that we learned is how different we actually are. And yet we were insistent on learning the dimensions of what collaboration might mean. Collaboration doesn't necessarily just mean holding hands around the campfire and singing nice songs. Collaboration is a challenge. Collaboration is a gift, and collaboration is a burden. And for people who had spent decades in 5 different fields, this was the first problematic of the book. The second problematic was that putting so we felt that we needed to be true to the idea of collaboration for ourselves, but also for the book. And because of that, we realized that we couldn't just accept 100 different writers without sharing what the writers thought with the photographers, and then what the photographers thought about the writers. I'm not sure this has ever been done before, certainly not on this scale. And again, what was uncovered were the facets of working together, the facets of that a photograph is always made with and among others. We took this as a basic theoretical point. The history of photography we all learned it as a product of mainly individual heroes. And what we learned in doing this book is that actually there are individual heroes, but they work in and among others. And it was listening to the others at the same time as watching the heroes that has, I think, for me, utterly changed the way that I think about the history of photography. The third challenge of it was putting the projects in order in these 8 different clusters. So what is a cluster? We're calling it a chapter, but a cluster is actually a group of ideas about what collaboration is. Let me give you an example of the first cluster. The first cluster is what really pulled me in. It's called The Photographed Person is Always There. That's the name of the cluster. The photographed person was always there. What kind of a thing is that to say? What does that actually mean? Right? And I realized that not only is it a theoretical statement, it's a kind of a poetic statement. It's an archivable it's a statement about a principle of archiving. It's a statement with many different implications. And there are 8 of these. Photography makes sovereign power incomplete. But is another one. Potentializing violence. What does that mean? What possibly could you mean by talking about potentializing violence? And so then we had 100 different projects and 100 different writers who needed to go somewhere and could have gone in several of these different chapters or clusters. And so the third question was really, where do people go in these ideas?
Alors, since we started, you mentioned the cluster number 1, the photograph person was always there.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe the right time to dive into the cases, let's say. So, Laura, maybe
Sure.
You've selected the 2 cases that.
I thought I'd give an example of sort of how this worked, at least for me, because that phrase is what drew me into this project. That phrase, the photographed person was always there, because I couldn't understand what it actually meant, but it felt like it meant something important. And so an example of my thinking about what this phrase might mean, to think about collaboration in terms of that phrase, I worked on and have worked on in the past the photographic commitments of Frederick Douglass, who throughout his life had his photograph made. For decades, hundreds of photographs of Douglass throughout all of his travels, speaking for abolition and then after abolition, during Reconstruction, after. Douglass shows up before the camera again and again and again and asserts his personhood. The photographed person was always there. For a man who had been enslaved at birth and who was self-emancipated, to insist that the photographed person was always there, and to have a record of that in hundreds of different photographs was, to me, one meaning of what collaboration might mean in cluster one. Okay? The photograph person was, despite how much he changes over the decades, his presence is always there. But the second example that I chose...
Alors,
Yeah.
Susan, Laura, just wait 1 second
Oh, all right.
because Frederick Douglass. First, I want to explain. You have a double page of the book, and as you can see, you have a gray area on the left, which is what they all call the square. And the square is the idea of bringing together the photographs of the case, but also quotations, and also historical facts, and also a small summary. So, for example, you have on the right side, you have the outsider view, the contributor's text. For in that example, it's Sean Michel Smith and Maurice Wallace who wrote about the case, but they wrote their own view on the case. So you see again this collaborative method, let's say, protocol taking place. Alors, no, what I wanted to say is that Mr. Frederick Douglass, so in the 19th century, and it is one of the quotations on the left, I don't know if you are capable of reading it, but it's fabulous. So, and I think it's a summary of the whole project, so I will read it for you, and I will translate it for you. Poets, prophets, and reformers are all pictures makers. And this ability is the secret of their power and of their achievements. They see what ought to be by their reflections of what is, and endeavor to remove the contradiction. So I will translate because it's not so easy for the people who speak French. Les pontes, les prophètes et les révolutionnaires sont tous des créateurs d'images, et cette faculté est le secret de leur pouvoir et de leur prouesse. Ils voient ce qui devrait être en réfléchissant à ce qui est et s'efforcent de résoudre cette contradiction. Ça a été écrit par un ancien esclave, donc vous avez compris, noir américain au 19e siècle. Et c'est un peu le résumé du livre. C'est assez extraordinaire que cette citation apparaisse dans le premier cas du livre, parmi 115. Alors, we move to the second case.
So that's the first project of the whole book. And in relation to it, we added another project by a photographer from the early 20th century to mid-20th century, Horace Pulaw, who is overlapping in time with Edward Curtis's romantic photographs of disappearing Indians, but is photographing his own community in Oklahoma as they are in their actual, real daily life, in and amongst community with others, with him. They are photographed persons who were always there, but in a different way from Douglass. If you think of Curtis's images, which many of you know, and then you think of Pulaw's images actually overlapping in time with them, you begin to see how that encapsulated poetic phrase, the photographic person was always there, can trigger thoughts about the relationship of the projects that are in each square. What is similar and what is different between Pulaw and Douglass? What is similar and what is different between the two of them and Curtis, who's also in the square, right? So the square becomes a thinking structure. And that, to me, is the largest contribution of the book, is that you can look at the square, think about the relations of the elements, and think about how you would use them in your own work, either as a practitioner or as a writer or as a teacher.
Alors, we're going to move to some other cases. Maybe, Wendy, you will comment on two other cases from the cluster number 2. The title of the cluster is Reshaping the Authorial Position. And so the chapter brings together some photographers who have used collaborative methods with the subject and acknowledge them as such, transforming the act of photography into an encounter. So the idea of really be together, sing together, and make the picture together. Alors, you've selected as one very relevant cases because it's your cases.
Yes, it's not
your
so
case.
random.
It's one of the many stories you've been through during your life, but you have two cases in the book. And so can you tell us about this experiment you did with the students in the Appalachian Mountains? It's a very beautiful title because you call that Portraits and Dreams. And please explain to us how it happened.
Well, this is something that I did in the 70s, in the late 70s, and worked with this group of children for 5 years in one school. And they took pictures. We had a dark room and a studio, and they were working 2 days a week. And so they became real photographers in the sense that they knew what they wanted to do, how they used the camera, they developed their film, they printed their pictures, and then, had exhibitions, the first at ICP, and they had never left Kentucky before. So we took a bus and went up. So it was a big project for all of us for many years. And so the picture on the left, on your left, is one of the boys showing his pictures to his parents, and then below, in one of the texts, that were one of the translations of texts from interview, is we had a shoebox there in the back of the house that we kept a lot of the pictures in, and then Mama bought us a photo album. And she let us put them in the photo album. She'd look at them and say, well, let's see if we can find a better one for the photo album, and put the rest in the box. I've still got my photo album up there. That's something I'll probably never part with. So after those 5 years, I didn't work with them until 30 years later, when we started making a movie about who they'd become and what this experience had meant to them, how they saw photography, how they used it now, etc. And then actually the subjects that they worked on were and why it's called Portraits and Dreams, is that they photographed themselves, their families, and their dreams or fantasies that they recreated. And on the right are pictures taken by Denise Dixon. She didn't actually push the shutter, but she organized the shot and then had different parents or friends take the pictures. And the top one is called I Dreamed, or I Am Dolly Parton. And this was in 1976. I don't know if you know the singer Dolly Parton, but she then, Dolly Parton, wrote Denise, and they communicated, etc. But so this is like many of our projects, is something that keeps going.
Hello.
And
we're going to move to
Vika?
a very important and strategic case that was initiated by Bieke Deporter on following the Spring Revolution in Egypt. So Bieke Deporter went to Cairo, and as a foreigner, of course, and she wanted to understand and be part of the kind of spirit of the revolution, and she asked some Egyptian citizens if she could stay with them for a while. Wendy, this is we can see there is a process in many steps. Can you describe these steps into the collaborative protocol?
Yeah. Yeah. So she took pictures while she was there, and then worked for a few years to put it together into a dummy, and instead of making a book right away, she thought she'd go back. So she took the dummy back, or the book dummy back, and she asked different people who she met in a random sort of way, in the same random sort of way she met the people to begin with that she photographed, and had them write on the back of the pictures in many cases the questions of these viewers or that she showed the pictures to, and some of them, for example, are that the one of the kitchen in there. Some of the questions that they said is, what is the purpose of this picture? There are no houses that look like this that are close to the pyramids. A picture of a house of someone poor to make the rich think about how they need the basic requirements for a good life. And it goes on, so the questions that she was gathering and the responses to the pictures were another layer from actually, the people who were in them or seeing them. So the audience becomes then again another important part.
You can see that some pictures are very much been written on, and there is a comment in the book saying the more they dislike the picture, the more they write on it, the more the image becomes invisible. So it's interesting that the people who are asked to react sometimes are capable of erasing the image somehow. Thank you very much, Wendy. So we're going to move completely to almost the end of the book with a third cluster, which is co-archiving. And Susan has selected the two cases. So the chapter explores how communities reshape their self-image and identity by bringing together or appropriating archive of their own. So, Susan, again, the first case is your case. If we can, since you're here, it's great that you. Many of you are familiar with this great project that Susan has pursued for years, but maybe some other ones you're not too familiar. So we thought we would ask Susan to explain.
No, before I kind of felt like. Before I do that, I wanted you to hear in this cluster, again, cluster is a set of ideas about co-archiving in this case. So Francis Benjamin Johnson in conversation with Carrie Mae Weems, an anti-fascist struggle in Spain, white cameras, black reading, Richard Wright, acting together, Kamwange, an African diaspora, conserving a legacy, Radio Venceremos, which is based in El Salvador, documenting its own process of guerrilla actions. It's more convincing this way. Walid Rod, the Atlas Group, which I'm sure we could talk about why that's there. It is, and then you come to me, and before I end with that, Eric Gottesman, If I Were an Artist, a project that relates to AIDS and people who were stigmatized to be visualized. And we're going to come to the last project. But I wanted to contextualize why I'm obviously in this what you're seeing here is a project in which I begin as a photographer going after the Gulf War in 1990, and document the exhumations as the Kurds have fled into Turkey and Iran. Very quickly, what I see is something like what you see in this one in the square on the above picture. People have pictures. I'm making pictures. People have pictures. So what are the pictures they have? Becomes, why do they have pictures? Why do they carry the pictures? Where do they carry the pictures? Who made the pictures? And a whole set of questions begin, such that I shift my practice, and that's kind of what you see on the bottom, on the left, from making pictures to reproducing their pictures with Polaroid film, positive, negative. Some of you would remember that, I hope, in which you see the negative. I'm not taking the pictures from them, the vintage pictures they might have, family pictures, but I'm sharing the contributions that they're making to this idea of a collective narrative of history. So the arch, in my own, this is an important project for me, obviously, I'm shifting my practice in response to a community with whom I then pursue and explore what fragments of history survive. I go from public archives in France, in England, in the US, to family archives. As you see, I'm bringing my research back to the community. They see what I've found in Western archives, and they begin to open up family collections. And what you see on the right is just a representation of the next stage of the project, moving from a book form, initially only in English and secondarily in the regional languages, and then ongoing, moving from really the fixed form of a book, using the internet as an ongoing means of dialogue. So that's what we called AKA Kurdistan, was 1998. Book came out in 97. It was coincidental that there was an internet where people could continue to contribute images. And the image you see above is taken just a few months ago in Vienna, where people, instead of uploading, they're now physical stories. And every time I show the work, I invite the Kurdish community and the diaspora to contribute new stories. I think it's an example of not just co-archiving, meaning I'm the curator and I but in an engaged way with with the community that brings many different elements together.
Alors, of course, what is really, really astonishing with this given project, which I know a little bit about, is that, as you guess, the Kurds are the largest people on earth with no country, no nation. And so that they are dispersed among several countries, and that is why it's quite extraordinary that suddenly someone like Susan comes and says, okay, we're going to start and pick up your pictures and start a kind of national library out of nowhere. And so you can imagine the scope of the project is unbelievable in a way. It's summarized in a double spread in the book, but in fact it's a whole a national with no nation endeavor. I was really astonished, Susan, by one of the comments that they say in one of the witness, let's say, a contributor says, owing or even reading this book would send many to jail, torture, and even execution. So here we are targeting another aspect of collaboration, is that you have, let's say, an ideal of the collaboration, which is to bring together pictures that were not brought before by the community, and bringing identity to a group. And here it's a people. But there is also a kind of collateral effect that this book, which is also seen as a threat by the authority of the three countries, cannot be distributed or promoted or discussed in a completely free way. So that's a kind of difficult.
Thank you
aspect.
so much for saying that, because, of course, in thinking about all the things we're trying to tell you in very, very short time, but that's really a very complex process. So here I am making a book with a community this is a history that's been suppressed, which means that making the book itself, participating, one's at risk, and then also having the physical object. It's banned in Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. So, and yet it is a national archive, which doesn't exist in any other. There's no Bibliothèque Nationale, Library of Congress, et cetera, in Kurdistan. But it kind of links in a very powerful way to what we're going to show now. So
yes, alors the link with the second subject is quite obvious. Rehearsing Palestinian rights. Here, Susan, we've chosen together to talk about this Emily Jassir, Palestinian artist with an American passport, and it's very important for the case. Emily Jassir on Palestinian community. So, as you know, in Palestine, the Palestinians have a very restricted possibility to move and to go back sometimes to places that are part of their family history because they have been displaced. And Susan, can you explain what Émilie Jacir, who is not living in Palestine, but proposed some Palestinians to do? That's amazing.
Yeah, well, first of all, you have to understand we thought about doing all of this before October 7th.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite painful to read this, and I almost wondered whether or not we should show it. It feels very violent to show it, and yet I think it makes it all the more poignant for all of us who are living with this streaming information and images, etc. So I'm kind of emotional even thinking that even 4 days ago we weren't thinking all that we're absorbing. But just a tease of what Emily is doing. She's asking someone in Palestine at this time, and this is 2001, this project, 2001. So again, we're looking at history over a long set of decades. And just as a tease of what you see under the photograph of the two women, she says, visit my mother, hug and kiss her, and tell her that these are from her son. Visit the sea at sunset and smell it for me and walk a little bit. Enough. Am I greedy? Now, I could read more of this, but I almost can't, quite honestly. I mean, I happen to have, when we did this project, Wendy knew Emily. I had seen Emily's work. I knew this project had to be part of co-archiving in this very complex way. There's another project that has a tension with this project, which is the Thames project, in which there are a group of volunteer photographers in the U.S. who, on behalf of prisoners, make the photographs that they desire to see. So they're photographers are being deployed on behalf of a prisoner. What Emily is doing is literally going and doing the action of what she's been asked and invited to do on the behalf of someone who is forbidden to travel. And what she writes, and this is where it's particularly difficult, just as a fragment, this is even more true than when we wrote it a year ago. This work would be impossible to create today due to the colonial regime's dense matrix of internal and external checkpoints, segregated roads, closed military areas, buffer zones, and more than 435 miles of concrete walls and electronic fences, which is more entrenched than ever. These measures have been implemented and designed to fragment and destroy the fabric of our entire people. I mean, we put this square together a couple of years ago, and here we are living this reality. It's kind of...
She made this work long before we
she
started
made
putting together the square.
2001.
Yeah.
2001. So time. And how time, I think it's an important thing we weren't planning to talk about. Wendy talked about working in the field with a group of students over 5 years to make a book. My book took 7 years to make with the community, and then it had an extended relationship. Now we're talking about 20 plus years after a body of work has been made, in which it has all the more poignance for those of us who are trying to make sense of the world today. So I think the book has these layers of experience embedded in it. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Alors, we're gonna move to a few questions because in the book, for me it was a little bit strange at the beginning when I discovered the book, because in French, collaboration, kind of imply that there is a positive gesture on both sides. We agree on something. But in the book, in some 2 clusters, I think, there is what is underlined is a lack of collaboration or a forced collaboration. So as you can see, we are shifting from a positive collaboration, something which helps the two parties to move forward, to something which is very painful, obviously, even if over time a positive collaboration can follow a forced collaboration. So let's go in the first cases that Laura, I think you will comment on that case. We've selected a case with a French photographer, Mac Garanger, because we thought you may know the pictures and that it's interesting to recontextualize this case in the whole framework of the book. Laura, you want to?
Yeah, well, so from what has been written, which is really all I know. Okay. Marc Garanger was a soldier, a photographer in the army, and was French army, and was compelled under orders to take photographs of unveiled Algerian women who were being moved into, they were being relocated, taken out of their homes and villages, relocated into DP camps, and they needed ID cards. Right? And this was his job assigned to him by the army. And, you know, he had a choice. You have a choice. The army owns you. You can refuse, and there'll be major consequences of that, or you can do what the army tells you to do. And he struggled with this, but he took these pictures. And you can see in the pictures, and those of you that know the pictures have seen this, how furious the women are. They are just, I mean, this is such a travesty for them. They're just furious. And he takes them, hundreds of pictures, for ID photographs for this displacement. But he thinks about it afterwards, and years later he goes back with the pictures, and he tries to find the women. He finds many of the women, and they discuss what it meant to them. They discuss that it actually does mean something to them to have, some of them, to have these pictures. And there is a kind of civility in the exchange, and he then has an exhibition. But below the civility, there's the fact that no one has forgotten anything about the forced collaboration. The one level of the army forcing Garanger, and the other level of Garanger obeying orders and forcing these women to do this. So collaboration in this sense doesn't just mean that you hold hands and walk into the future together. Collaboration can be forced. Diana and I have had discussions about this, of whether complicity is a better idea, whether there might be other words besides collaboration. But if you remember, I said I got pulled into this whole project because of poetry, because of that first cluster title, the photographed person was always there. And that phrase was so haunting for me. We're trying to do the same thing with the word collaboration. We're trying to expand its resonance and the places where you might think that collaboration is happening. I think the Emily Jacir example is actually an example of her, you could think, collaborating with history without even knowing the future that was going to be more and more exposed by her project. We don't usually think about collaborating with history. We have a chapter on our cluster on collaborating with the landscape. Some photographers will really understand that in a deep way, but it doesn't make sense to everybody. But the word collaboration is an analytical term that's meant to grow, and it is not meant to be a happy term all the time. And the Marc Garanger memories that have not gone away is a good example of that.
Alors, we're going to move to another also example of a case called camouflaged camera. And here again, you will see that this collaboration aspect is a little bit going far away, because here we are talking, Laura, about the secret police Apparatus in order to make portraits and to bring surveillance to Prague residents. So I guess we are under the communist regime. And here you can see a few of the apparatus that were brought together, to hidden apparatus, in order to bring the whole population under surveillance. So we understand that here the idea of the book about collaboration is a little bit strange, because there's not even one author,
Right.
and there's not even one subject.
Right.
So it's a little bit not vague, but so broad as an idea. Can you a little bit comment on that?
Well, I mean, I agree with you totally. You articulated it really well. It's a bit strange. The whole cluster on the apparatus is a bit strange. Because how is it that we have come to take the machine of the camera, the apparatus of the camera, has come so fully into our lives, into our body language, into our ritual, into our clothing, into our lighting, into the places we live, that we are working with a surveillance regime without even recognizing that that's what we're doing. The people that are working against surveillance, surveillance, from blowing up surveillance from underneath, paint their faces, create reflective clothing, jam the signals, because they have noticed that the apparatus of photography in surveillance is all around us. I mean, we could probably find cameras. I do this. We could probably find lots of cameras around. Surveillance is all around us. And what are the ways in which we're cooperating with that life situation? And how do we make it apparent to us? So that cluster takes this example of these really crazy. I mean, there's a camera hidden in the baby carriage. There's, the people were remembering that these cameras were all around. And how is it that we have come to become accustomed to the regime of the apparatus under the sign of surveillance? That's the question. We are collaborating with a regime of surveillance. There are other things that we could be doing. So that's the way I think of it. There's a funny note about this, by the way, that some of the activists who saved these pictures, when they saw the films, 30 years later, they were very, these are people that showed up in the files, right? These are people, it was dangerous for them to have their pictures made, but they saw the pictures and they said, look how young we were. Look how brave we were. Look what we were trying to do. It's kind of a funny side note to that there is this record also that was made that can be revalued by being looked at again. Yeah.
As part also of the question about this notion of collaboration, I would like to ask Susan, because here we're talking about a little bit a collaborative protocol with a landscape. So what does it mean to collaborate with a landscape, and what does it mean maybe to reshape a landscape, to reshape identity through a landscape? And we thought together that this Joel Sternfeld On This Site, because the book is called On This Site, was a little bit exemplary of the questions that are raised by the book around this loose notion of collaboration that we mentioned.
As Laura said, collaboration with landscape, historical. We call this cluster Photography Preserves Sovereign History as Incomplete. Now is that poetic? But what Joel writes about, and that's what you need to hear, because that's the construct here. I went to Central Park. This is the practitioner at work. I mean, this is what we wanted to reveal. I went to Central Park to find the place behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art where Jennifer Levin had been killed. It was bewildering to find a scene that's so beautiful, to see the same sunlight pour down indifferently on the earth. As I showed the photograph of this site to my friends, I realized that I was not alone in thinking of her. It occurred to me that I held something within, a list of places that I cannot forget because of the tragedies that identify them. I began to wonder if each of us has such a list. I set out to photograph sites that were marked during my lifetime. That's a fragment, but that gives you a feeling of what the motivation is. And the book has been a seminal project, I'm sure, for many of you on this site for decades. It was done in 1994, so we're talking about 30 years ago, and yet it's such a resonant, kind of construct for a practitioner to think about not only what you see before you, what has come before you were there, and what will happen after that in relation to people you may or may not know, which is all of what surrounds what some of these projects are trying to provoke,
Yeah, and we know that Tyrone Simon was very much inspired by this project when she did the DNA project, bringing
and the innocence too.
The Innocence. The book is called Innocence, bringing back people who spent years in jail and have been proved innocent thanks to the DNA. So it's interesting that the collaboration also can be built over time by one project kind of resonating onto another project. So that's also a nice way to see it. Alors, we will finish on the last case because to bring a kind of activist flavor to the last case, which I think is nice. So, Wendy, there is this very famous campaign to boycott in South Africa Polaroid. You can see in the middle of the double page the tract which were given away by activists in order to boycott Polaroid. So how do you see? Maybe you can explain why, and how do you see the consciousness of a problem being turned into an action? So here we're talking more about it's not really a collaboration. It's more like an action taken after something has been revealed as a protocol.
I think one thing that's important is that to know also is that Polaroid was very important to a lot of us as photographers and workers, so it had a lot of resonance, and I didn't know about it early on. And do we know when that was? Let's see. I think it was in the 70s. Do you know when it was?
It's 1970. Yeah, it started in 1970.
Yeah, and so I was we were just starting to do stuff then, and but what because Polaroid had provided the South African government with the machines to take ID pictures for the passbooks. And so after following up on that, they eventually were banned from South Africa, Polaroid. And so this has a resonance for me because I went to South Africa and I didn't know about this. And so I bought Polaroid cameras and then took them with me. And I was working in Soweto and another Orange Farm, which was another settlers community. And at one point, there was a group of kids taking pictures together. I wasn't with them. And they were arrested, and the cameras were taken, and eventually the police said, you can go, but we're keeping the cameras. And so I had to go and, talk to them, et cetera. And then out of that, we had to make a decision, the children and I and other people, about what they should do. Whether should they take these cameras and keep photographing. The police told them they had to keep notes with them when they had the cameras. And they said no. They voted and said, no, we don't want to do that. We have a right to take pictures. And so that is another kind of collaboration that I never anticipated. And so these stories keep going.
Alors, since we are running out of time, you understand that we can go endlessly talking about these cases, 115 in the book, spanning different periods, different geographical situations, problematics, poetics, politics. So that's why the book is such a network of ideas and so valuable, I think. So I would just like to finish by asking the three of you a question. I was at the last, maybe some of you were at the last Berlin Biennale, and that Kaderatia put together, and a lot of the pieces that were shown as art, including one Ariela Azoulay work, were in fact what we call now artivist, which is a contraction of art and activism. Artivist, very strange word. So there is a kind of link, because of course in the history of the art market, because we are in a fair, the art market has always put more value on the singular vision, the authorship, one given Susan, Wendy, Diane Arbus, Irving Penn, whatever. So they are heroes, like you say at the beginning of the book, but much less on this collaborative practice. And if you do the tour of the fair, you will see a little bit. Now it's starting to appear, but usually you don't see much of this collaborative practice. They are the projects that are left aside by the market. So do you see now, built on this example of the Venice Biennale, more artivism or artivists being favored by the art market? Is it now the fact to be an artivist? Is it a value for your oeuvre?
I mean, this has been going on for a long time. Yes, this discussion, and some of us anyway have had, thought about different ways to change things, and we kept saying to each other, "Oh, it's coming, and that's a very good question. Is it coming? I mean, it hasn't really come, but it is better than it was, and you have curators who are interested in working with it, and you also have writers and museums. So I think maybe it is coming, but and I hope this book helps.
Susan, you want to comment on that?
I don't know. I think one part of contemporary practice is obviously in the field of reenactment and performative work, and that's very acceptable, and there's plenty of it out there. So I don't know the term artivista, and which part of my body goes in which direction or the other. I mean, and whether or not it makes a difference. Indifference to whom? And I guess I still live with that question. Who are we making the work for? How does it function in this world where we know it has to function at some level, and yet it's not enough in the world where it really needs to make a difference? So I don't know what's coming, honestly.
So we leave it open like that. So we have just a few minutes for questions. We thought we should open the floor to reactions, questions, remarks.
Diane, can I just make an acknowledgement that in our audience, there are many people, some of whom we've only had emails with, and we don't even know what they look like, but I want to just acknowledge some. Masha's here from Ukraine. There's a wonderful project of hers. Didier, you're here and you wrote a fantastic piece. Laureate Novak behind him, wonderful project that we've been able to include. Ripsime Vizer back there talking about Rinika. I can't see you. Aloise, who we've never met. We've only been with email, so I can't know. Can't hear you.
I wrote about Bloomberg and Shanarin.
Oh, that's right. I just think of you with Rinika because Rinika is in our book. You did write about, and actually, it's a very interesting project about the Cuban psychiatric hospital and the moment in which they give the shutter release to those that they're looking at. It's an incredibly important seminal moment, I think. Of course, you see Cindy Sherman doing that, etc. I know there are others, but I can't see you.
No.
There are other people who have questions, but anyway, there are many. Ken Klitsch is here somewhere. Book of Beth, there he is. I mean, can't see everybody in the audience.
So you
but if
understood
have
that
a
half
question,
of the audience has contributed to the book one
not
way or
quite
another.
half, not quite
So-
half, but it was our invitation to come. So because everyone only knew what they were doing, and they were invited to participate in, and we haven't ever gotten together. So this is the closest we'll come. Who has a question? I don't know.
A question for Wendy, Laura, or Susan?
Laura.
Well, thank you so much for the incredible work that you put towards this book. I am with a human rights advocacy organization that leverages visual storytelling, working with a lot of documentary photographers across the globe, and something we are in constant kind of push-pull with is this idea of the last question of what happens after the story is told, what happens after the images are out there, and how do you really draw that connection to then an external audience, hoping that they'll care and activate upon the work. So have you done any thinking around what you want to do with the book in terms of also activating the book further? Are there other audiences that you're looking at to connect with?
Thank you for that, but I want to tell you about two projects that are in it because they speak exactly to those questions. One is with Witness, where they developed, some of you would know, a camera which blurs the face to protect people who are in demonstrations, which could be happening today in Paris, by the way. And that's a really important action that Witness took. That's in the Apparatus. That's an example of what Laura was talking about, the hidden surveillance, or how do you protect people who participate in an activist way. So one thing one of us was going to say, and we all forgot, is that as we made this, we moved from the walls to make a book. It's different to have a cluster of ideas on a wall, to experience it as a viewer, as you saw, to make a linear structure that feels very confined. So our dream, if anyone is out there, is to make a box. And the idea is the box of the squares, so anybody could put these squares into some other kind of configuration and conversation, which is exactly what Laura did. And it was done at Berkeley and Yale and other places. And Andrew Senegar, who's here with Thames and Hudson, and we have to thank him because no other publisher would probably have stuck with us through the ups and downs and complexity about this whole process. There was a lot of trust involved from the publisher too, and they should be acknowledged, as well as Delpierre. French translation, The Struggle was the title. So there's a lot of hidden labor that you probably have a sense of. But I think the box is the thing we dream of. So we're looking to see if we can raise the money to make that box freely available to any community center, to any school, because of course the book has a cost and it's physical to ship, and there are other ways that we're thinking about how to make it more accessible. So thanks for the question.
Maybe one last question, if you... there is a strong sign that we should end. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. Can we just tell you, a book signing, that we have a book signing, just so you know, and I want everyone, it's those of you who are contributors, they have books for you at the Delpierre stand. Those of you who would like a French edition, it's at the Delpierre stand. We'll be there in about 20 minutes to sign. And if you want an English edition, I can tell you we're going to have to wait till after Christmas if you don't buy it here. So that's it. Thanks.